Folk dances have been part of the Philippine culture, which makes the country unique and have been preserved through documentation. The documentation of intangible cultural heritage has been a long-standing challenge within the archival community. Early records of the Philippine dance had been written by foreigners, and true documentation of dance only came in the second quarter of the 20th century by Francisca Reyes Aquino in the late 1920s. As a dance research, this study is qualitative and ethnographic in nature, which engage in the philosophical and socio-cultural underpinnings of the unpublished local folk dances of Merida Leyte. More so, this study will end in view of developing dance literature for cultural preservation and aims to contribute to Aquino's pioneering works. As a method, this study will adapt the Philippine folk dance documentation framework visualized by Domingo, and dance analysis will adapt Carayaga's guidelines for analysis of specific movements. As a cultural advocate and a lifetime member of the Samahang Tagapagtaguyod ng Katutubong Sayaw ng Pilipinas, the researcher strongly believes that as an outcome of this study, these dances will be preserved as good material in promoting appreciation and love for Meridanos' cultural heritage. Thus, it needs to be preserved and treasured by the people and must be introduced to the students. In this regard, it contributes to the repertoire of dances that were pioneered by Mrs. Francisca Reyes Aquino, who provided a source of materials for schools in the field of dance as well as in the allied disciplines that need a better understanding of our culture. Through developing dance literature as an outcome of this study, it will be easier to integrate these dances into lessons, particularly in physical education classes. This research is anchored with the study and findings of Domingo, which revealed that the folk dance documentation practices in the Philippines involve ethical consideration, methodology, actual dance documentation, evaluation, and output. The researcher also intends to examine the philosophical underpinnings of the local folk dances through ontology, epistemology, axiology, and methodology. This philosophical stance is required in conducting the study to provide grounding on the perceptual perspective on what to look and how methodologically describe the events in this study. Reality will be seen as multiple and subjective, constructed by individuals. Goals and themes, in the words of the informants, will be reported to provide evidence of different perspectives. Ontologically, it seeks to determine the underlying reality, nature, beliefs, culture, and traditions as lived by the Meridanos, considering the physical, emotional, and cultural appeal. Epistemologically, it seeks to determine the relationship between the researcher and what will be studied. These were done through an in-depth interview by the researcher and the informants. The different movements, dance positions, and formations were observed by the researcher. The researcher then observed and interacted with the informants to gather all the necessary information and attempted to minimize the distance between himself and that being researched. Utilizing fieldwork, the researcher collaborated and spent time in fields with the participants. From an axiological perspective, the dance movement were analyzed according to the underlying values, emotions, expressions, ethics, and aesthetics which form part of the notation of the local folk dances. This study seeks to answer a question on the role of values in the inquiry and assume that subjective values are inevitable, desirable, and value-laden. Personal interpretation of the local folk dances was reported in concurrence with informants' interpretation. Methodologically, in observing the rhetoric assumption, the language utilized was personal and engaging. The data gathered during the cultural mapping activity was chronologically arranged and sequenced from the key informants. Subjectivity might occur since the researcher has insider knowledge of the local dances because he is a native of the place. Along the documentation process, non-quantifiable qualities might become an object for subjectivity, such as the emotional appeal of the dance. To avoid subjectivity and emerging interpretations dominating the process, certain guidelines must be adopted, especially in the analysis of movements. Since this study is field research, the researcher will use an opportunistic or emergent sampling that is flexible and will make sampling decisions during the process of collecting data. As the researcher gains more knowledge on Meridanon's local dances as the informants unfold, the researcher will make sampling decisions that could take advantage. Flexible research and sampling design is an important feature of qualitative research, particularly when the research being conducted is exploratory in nature. To come up with dance literature, the analyzed dance movements will be written in a narrative presentation with qualification analysis that seeks understanding, especially on the movement patterns. As qualitative research, the study underwent 3 phases of data processes and analysis. The visual model and study framework presents the overall framework and how the study will be conducted. Phase 1 documented the 4 local folk dances as an output of the cultural mapping activity of the municipality of Merida Leyte. It will adopt the Philippine folk dance documentation framework. This represents an informal collection of dances by which informants were carefully selected based on their knowledge about local folk dances in the local community through multiple types of gathering information. Informations and field notes on the content of their stories or narration are essential in this phase. Phase 2 of the study analyzed the documented local folk dances as to their perspectives according to their philosophical and histo-cultural underpinnings. The informant stories were analyzed and then retold into a framework that makes sense, retelling the process of reorganizing the stories into some general type of framework. This framework may consist of gathering stories, analyzing them for the elements, and rewriting the stories to place them within the organizational sequence. One aspect of chronology is the narration that has a beginning, middle, and end. The storyline will include information about the setting or context of the local folk dances. The Cariagas guidelines for the analysis of specific movements that portray character traits and customs depicted in a folk dance completed the dance chronology. Phase 3 focused on the creation of dance literature based on the results of Phase 2. The dance literature of the 4 local folk dances of Merida is the core output of this study, which will then be good material in the preservation of the intangible cultural heritage of the Meridanons and for future generations to come.